So really what I want to concentrate on is what we think about the moral rights, when we talk about moral entitlement to have something. And here I would like to argue that I think that women do have particular moral rights, in fact, that pertain to the issue of abortion. The first one is the right of control over their own body, and the second one is the right to make moral decisions that specifically affect them more than anyone else. Now, when it comes to control over their body, I think that the whole notion that we exist in and of ourselves, those of you who have touched on philosophy will know the Kantian imperative well, but that sort of notion that we exist and have value in and of ourselves, we're not a means to an end, we're not something that exists just for other purposes, is incredibly important. It's a very important value. It's basically what stops a doctor from making a decision that I can be harvested for my organs. You could say that if I was broken down into body parts, far more benefit could be obtained from society than having me as an entire whole. You could give my kidneys to 2 people who were suffering from kidney disease. You could use my lungs, you could use my heart. You can't do that, even though it may benefit society, because we accept and accept that our human bodies are our own and are, to an extent, inviolable. That's why we place such an emphasis on consent with regard to medical practice. It's interesting that when it comes to giving birth, such is the law's regard to that whole question of autonomy and someone's right to do what they will with their own body and to consent, that a woman cannot be forced to have a caesarean section to deliver her child, even if doctors understand fully that, that her not having a caesarean may result in the death of the child, because we accept that unless a woman is mentally incompetent, she should be able to make the decision that she will not have an operation done to her. And I think that that's incredibly important. And so when it comes to the issues of pregnancy and when it comes to the issues of birth and abortion, I do not think that when a woman becomes pregnant, we should take that right to decide what happens to her own body away from her. I do not think that a woman should be ever compelled to have an abortion, but nor do I think that she should be compelled to have a child. You may think that it's morally wrong, but I don't think that she should be compelled into that situation. You may say that it would be morally wrong for me to refuse to donate bone marrow that could save my son's life if I was the only donor that was able to make that. But you could not force me in law to make that donation. I would think that it's morally wrong. You would no doubt think that it's morally wrong, but I could not be forced to do that. And I think that exactly the same approach should be taken with regard to pregnant women, that you may think it is wrong for her to decide to end her pregnancy, but it is her body, and that must be ultimately respected. The second thing that I think is crucially important is the importance of decision-making. And that also is where I think that morals really maketh man, as we might say, in this particular instance. Because I think that we should accept that when areas are morally contested, as the value of life of the embryo, as abortion really is, then people should have the right to follow their conscience. And I think that conscience is weighted in 2 directions on this. The women that I see, or the women that come to our clinics, feel that the decision that they are taking to end their pregnancy is entirely one that is the right decision for them to make. And I feel that because that affects them most closely, they should be able to make that decision for themselves. Now that decision, what would interfere with that, what would mitigate that, is if we felt that the embryo should have personhood status. But I think that what we need to look at is what it is that makes us human. Is it DNA? Is it a beating heart? Or is it something more than that? Is it an ability to feel, to know, to understand, to have hopes and dreams for the future? Is that thing that you might call a soul? Because I think it's more, we are more than just flesh and bones. Thank you.
Good evening, I'm absolutely thrilled to be here tonight with Anne and all of you. Thank you for inviting me. I was reading, for the purposes of joy and delight, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights the other night, and discovered that Charles Malik, who was one of the people who drafted it, said this about it, that human rights are a definition of what man is, and that freedom, justice and peace are founded on a recognition of the inherent dignity of the equality and inalienable rights of all members of the human family. Now, Article 3 declares that everyone has the right to life, liberty and security of person. Article 5 declares that you have the freedom from torture or cruel and inhuman behaviour. And Article 25 deals with motherhood and childhood, which are entitled to special care. Now, this word in here is extremely important because it means that it belongs to the being, the human person, to exist permanently and inseparably from that person. That right is intrinsic, that right to life. It belongs to the thing by its very nature. Now, why is this so important to this debate? Now, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights came about because of the United Nations in 1948, because of the experiences of the Second World War and the violation of human rights. And so they wanted to make an ethic really clear, whereby one set of people could not take away from another set of people rights that belonged inherently to them. In other words, one set of people could not say, we do not value you, therefore you do not have value. And this is extremely important in this debate. Now, the other reason why rights exist is because we all know from history and reading world literature and living and watching EastEnders that people very often will take the power to do what they will if it is of convenience to them. And so human rights exist to mitigate this ancient ethic of might is right. So, an unborn baby is a very small and defenceless being, a human being with human life. So why has it ever become right in anybody's mind that it should be aborted? Now, I was having a debate with Mel Hoffman on Radio 4, and she wrote a very interesting thing in the introduction to her book. She said that one day she went to a party, and her numbers were read, and somebody said to her, wow, these are power numbers. And she said, I know. And then the person said, your numbers tell me that you make money from war. And she said, I do. Now, Mel Hoffman has been setting up abortion clinics for many years, and she's a very well-intentioned lady, and she believes that does a lot of people a lot of good. But the ethic by which she declares that she has the right to abort unborn human babies is this, and it says it in the introduction to her book. Women and those who provide abortions have the right and responsibility to take away life in order to gain control of their own lives. And I would propose that that is not the ethic. Might is right, the ethic of gaining control over your own life, not by a creative discourse with the world, but with the death of another person, is exactly what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights exists to prevent. Now, if you believe in just war theory, then you will see that perhaps the war now is against the unborn child. Now, George Orwell said that, in his brilliant essay on the English language, that if you want to abuse people, you first have to abuse the language. You have to undergo a little bit of verbal engineering to convince people that some people are not people, they are not persons. Now, one day a young man was working in a lab, and he received a parcel, and inside was a human baby. And he worked in a tissue lab, and he wasn't really meant to receive human babies in parcels, but there it was. And he tried to look at the label to find out who it was, and he saw POC as the labelling of that parcel, which meant products of conception. And that was the moment when he broke down and realised that there was a lot of label engineering going on in the debate around human life. And that was the turning point for him. Now, how is it that we can say whether a human being is a human person? Now, we can start from different standpoints. Perhaps we can start from function. A person is a person if they can do things, say things. Now we know that an unborn baby can have brain waves at 10:25, days, a beating heart at 21, at 20 weeks can recognise the theme tune from EastEnders. If that's a sign of consciousness, that's a debate we can have later. As I worked on the EastEnders website, I'm allowed to be rude about EastEnders, but my hidden life. Anyway, so we have to think, what are the signs? But the point is that if function is the definition of whether you're a person, who's going to decide what functions make that applicable? What if somebody has autism? You know, they may not have the same relationship to persons as other people might. And you will find that if you're defining a human person through function, you'll always find that an arbitrary set of markers will have to be defined by an arbitrary set of people. And something that Peter Kreeft said very cleverly, I think, he said that anywhere where there is a vested interest in certain people being dead, there will be some people trying to define them as non-persons. Now, I imagine I have a very short amount of time to make two small points. I'd like also to think about whether abortion is a violation of a woman's rights. What is it about abortion that reduces the dignity of woman? Now, we know that there are many people who had abortions who campaign now for more informed choice, because they didn't feel they were told what the full implications of that abortion was to their unborn baby. For a start, they were told perhaps that it wasn't a baby, and they later see in the toilet that there is very much a little human baby there and not a a blob of cells. And so they've not really been told the truth. Their reality as a woman and as a mother has in a sense been violated. Now, there is an ethic that is different to might is right, and that is the logic of love as opposed to the logic of power. The logic of love is to do with placing relationship at the centre of life. And when you read a story such as the one in which a lawyer and his wife recently have had 4 embryos implanted in 2 surrogate wombs in India, I use the word advisedly, those of course are 2 women in India, and all of those babies took. The agency rang up and said, "Oh dear, all 4 have taken, shall we do the necessary?" Necessary meaning getting rid of 2 of them. So what I'd like to suggest is that now that women have been reduced to the level of 2 wombs in another country who would abort or not abort, and it wouldn't be their choice either, I would suggest that abortion is nearly always in the process of violating at least more than one person's human rights: the woman, the baby, the father, and all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. We will now move into 2 speeches dedicated to refutation. So the first one will be over to Anne. That'll be 3 minutes, and because the speech is somewhat shorter, after 2 minutes have passed to indicate that you have 1 minute left, I'll just give a gentle rap like that, and that way you can know what is going on and begin to direct your remarks toward a satisfactory rhetoric poignant conclusion. So, commencing then, you have the floor for 3 minutes.
Well, I think that it's interesting that you raise the point that what's at issue here and underlies the whole basis of the rights discussion is that one set of people cannot take away from another set of people the rights that they have. And I think that one of the problems in the way that you pose this entire discussion is this assumption that fetuses, that embryos, are a class of persons, whereas I'd regard them in an entirely different way. And I think that the way that it's more helpful for us to look at this discussion is not to perhaps posit the question of whether fetuses are human or not human. They're obviously human, they're obviously living. The question isn't even whether we give them value or whether we don't give them value, because I think that I can completely accord the notion of the fetus having value and agree with that. The point is how much value do we accord it relative to the woman who is carrying that fetus when the issue is really presented in a way where that woman feels that she needs to, wants to, feels that it's morally right for her to end that particular pregnancy, because we're not in a situation under these circumstances where we're talking about simply an abstract situation of the balance between 2 living entities. We're talking about a situation where someone who is clearly a person with rights that must be respected is taking a decision about something which is indistinct from the integrity of her own life. And so I think that you have to think quite carefully how you think that the rights of embryos and fetuses can in any way be exercised except through the woman who is carrying them, and indeed what gives you the right, or indeed anyone else the right, to stand between a woman, a potential mother, and that decision about the child that you would otherwise bring into the world, which is really why I always throw the argument back to one of who decides and who makes that moral decision, since we are not talking about two people who are both cognizant of what's going on. This is not a situation where you're talking about slave owners versus slaves, or men versus women, or even adults versus children. You're talking about the views of a woman as against the beating heart of something that doesn't even know that it's alive yet. To my mind, you can accord that embryo and fetus value, but it need not be the equivalent value to that of a woman.
Thank you. Now it's your turn to reply, so you have 3 minutes, and just to refresh you, after 2 minutes have passed, we'll do that again in case you forgot.
It's very alarming, you know.
That is exactly what I have to do, though.
I was on a bus to Brixton the other day, and I was listening to a young man on his mobile phone. You get that pleasure on buses, don't you? Listen to all these conversations. And it was actually quite a traumatic conversation, as I remember, because he was actually talking to a social worker. And he was saying, please, please don't let her do it. Please, it's my baby. Please. I want her to have the baby. Please let me talk to her. And you know, the whole bus was listening. Obviously, it was better than working for EastEnders. And it was a very tragic moment, and it just resonated with me when Anne said that it isn't about two conscious people making a decision, it's about a woman. And I just wanted to flag up that there is also a father in this instance and other family members to be taken into account, because inside that woman's body the mystery of motherhood, which is a scientific reality but also a mystery in itself, because human consciousness and human being is a mystery. I spoke to a very fascinating man called Raymond Tallis. He's a very bright guy. He's a polymath, he's a neuroscientist, 35 years experience, and he was giving a talk at the Royal Society, and he said, you know, I know all there is to know about the human brain, but I cannot tell you, and nor can anyone else if they're being honest, when and how human consciousness arises from matter. Now, he isn't a closet religionist, in fact he's a celebrity atheist, in fact, very charming man. I sent him some of my poetry, which he liked, which made him even more charming. But that aside, just to stress that obviously Anne's work is phenomenally well-intentioned. She has a great passion for the well-being of women, and that's what comes across in everything that she says, and I deeply respect that. But I'd just like to point out that in fact, as we see, it's not just the woman's body, it's not just an obvious reality, oh, it becomes a person when we're not sure. And as we can see that in this very university, it's Julian with the unpronounceable surname. He thinks, as an ethicist here, he is debating and putting forth the idea that abortion after birth is a perfectly decent idea because we just don't know when someone becomes a person. And I'd like to point out that, in fact, many people who hold views of the well-being of women being brought about by abortion do sometimes change their mind. Bernard Nathanson, who carried out 75,000 abortions, changed his mind. Abby Johnson, who was Employee of the Month at Planned Parenthood, when she accompanied somebody through a suction abortion, and the abortionist went, "Beam me up, Scotty," when the little embryo disappeared, changed her mind. And I think these people are worth listening to as well-intentioned people like Anne, because trauma does happen, pain does occur, and many women feel violated and silenced by the fact that a society declares that they have to claim their rights when in fact they feel deeply wounded and violated by the abortions they've had, and many schemes to help them are in place. The British voices of those who are aborted, set up by Margaret Cotto. You can read about in this book. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That concludes the first part. The second part, as I said earlier, is the crossfire, the back and forth, which we will do in terms of starting with Anne. We'll ask one question. Sarah will then have 2 minutes to reply, after which Anne can ask a follow-up question, during which you have another 2 minutes to reply. So that'll happen once with you starting with the question, and then another time with you, and we'll do that 3 times back and forth, giving you each a chance to converse over some of the points that you may find at issue or worth discussing further. So with that having been said, for this one I'll do, again, the tap on the table when 1 minute has passed, and then my hand out such when 30 seconds remain, so you can see how much time you have to reply. So with that having been said then, Anne, if you'd like to commence with a question.
Yeah, given that you've acknowledged that someone like Raymond Tallis will make the point that no one particularly knows where consciousness begins, how would you argue against the notion that it should really be left to a woman's own individual moral conscience to determine what she thinks is in the best interests of her pregnancy and her family, given that nobody knows, there is an open question?
Well, do I sit down or stand up?
As you will.
I think I'll sit down. I think that firstly, the no one knows opens up various directions of thought. And the first would be the benefit of the doubt. In Australia, where animal embryos are respected very much, and they're not sure whether they experience pain during some kind of surgery or procedure, because there is a doubt, they've decided that they are going to inject those embryos with anaesthetics so that they don't feel pain in utero when they're being operated on. So there is that sort of benefit of the doubt, because it is a deeply important thing. And there's also the fact that although Raymond Tallis says that he doesn't know exactly when consciousness arises from matter, what he isn't saying is that he knows that there isn't a spiritual reality about that very first zygote that declares the reality of personhood. Because personhood can either spring from being or from function. And as we looked at the fact that functions change and evolve, after we're born we might evolve all sorts of things. So does that mean that we have less right to be, if we're more persons when we're older, we have less right to be killed than when we're younger? Basically, function cannot be the way of defining personhood, therefore being has to be the way forward. And the moment being and life occur is at conception. And so that is why I would say that we have to say, scientifically, morally, ethically, and philosophically, that is what we need to protect, the right to life and being of that unique entity.
Thank you. Another question to follow up?
Well, to say that I would agree with much of what you say, that being indeed is what's particularly important, and to me being a human is not simply being a beating heart and human DNA, but my question really is what sets you above a woman who is basically saying that, in her opinion, having weighed up the doubts, having weighed up the uncertainties, she feels that it is morally right for her to take the action in ending that particular pregnancy, given that she will be living with the consequences of that pregnancy and not you or anyone else?
Well, firstly, I would say that that seems to paint a very clear picture of a woman's agency at the moment of when they decide to have this abortion. And I would say from friends that I know, often they have had these abortions in moments of fear and terror. They haven't been surrounded by people who think that abortion is wrong. They've simply thought, oh my goodness, I better go and do this, oh my goodness, and off they go. And it is years later, perhaps, that they ring me up and say, gosh, Sarah, you're the only person who's going to take this phone call seriously, but I think I've been depressed for the last 10 years because of this, I've just become a Buddhist, I've been aware of things differently, etc. So it isn't that I'm making a decision over someone else, I'm aware of consequences that a person in a moment of great difficulty and often crisis might not be aware of. And also this right for women to make a clear decision. When you do stand outside abortion clinics and watch people go in, often they will come and talk to you, and they will say things like, well, you know, I have no choice. I've been told by my boyfriend that he's not going to stay with me, my husband's not going to stay with me if I don't have this abortion. So I think the story that women are being free when they have that abortion is optimistic, to say the least. And when the abortion laws were brought out in this country, the idea of abortion on demand, if the woman thought it worked for her, was not at all in the mind of the legislators. We now have 98% of abortions happening on social grounds. 90% of unborn children diagnosed with Down syndrome are aborted. This was not the intention of the Act, and it isn't me standing above women. It's being aware of the broader picture of women's lack of freedom, and also, always and everywhere, the lack of freedom of the embryo, the unborn person, to make that decision.
Thank you. All right, now you have a chance, Sarah, to ask a question for Anne.
Well, yes, I was wanting to ask Anne about this idea of person, because it is so interesting, isn't it? And I'm sure it isn't the one around which I think you're thinking turns as well, you know. Is that given the thinking in the university here recently about the idea of, because you can't define personhood, or the moment in which it arises, it's therefore perfectly licit to abort a child or kill a child after birth, which they call post-birth abortion. Would you also hold with that kind of thinking because of the doubt around when personhood arises?
I think it's a completely ludicrous concept, because to carry out an abortion is to end a pregnancy, it's to bring about a miscarriage. So clearly when you have a baby that's born, you cannot possibly carry out abortion. You're talking about infanticide, which I think is a completely different issue. Yes. What we're talking about here, what I think I'm talking about, is a situation where you have a woman who is pregnant and is making a decision about the future of her pregnancy and about the fetus, the child will be that she is carrying at that particular moment, which is why the agency of the woman, the opinions of the woman, the sense of what that woman is and what she wishes to do with her life is so completely vital and central to it.
So it seems that you are very much emphasising the autonomy and the right of the woman to make her own decision. And I'd like to ask something about what happens, in your opinion, when we centralise autonomy and calibrate our whole moral system around the idea of one person's choice. Does that not automatically, seen as we're having a discussion about rights, put other people's rights in danger? Because does that not return the ethic of the person in power? Obviously has the autonomy. They can, if they have the autonomy, I mean they have the power to make the decision, but the less powerful person is the unborn child, or indeed the husband who isn't allowed to have a say, or whatever. Surely this is a danger to rights in throwing autonomy at the heart of every moral decision to do with abortion.
Well, I think that with this, it would be difficult to just kind of generalise from the point that's being made here, because in exactly the same way that you would, I think, argue that for you life is sacrosanct and there can be no stepping back from that, for me the idea that you can use someone's body for something that they don't wish it to be used for is sacrosanct, and I don't think that I can step back from that. And I do think that when it comes to these particular personal decisions that relate to our very own selves, we can of course acknowledge that other people can have opinions, but at the end of the day, there is something about your own body which really does make it yours and no one else's. And I think that the idea that in pregnancy, women are pitched against their partners and pitched against their families is completely wrong. Of course what happens during a pregnancy is that people come to their decisions as part of a discussion with other people in their lives, and typically the women that we see in our clinics are accompanied to them by their partners who honestly believe that ending that pregnancy is the very best thing for them and their families. And it seems to me quite bizarre that you or anyone else would want to step between them and that decision.
Thank you. So now it'll be your turn to ask 2 questions following the same format as before.
Well, what does make you feel that you have the right to step between that particular woman and her decision about what is morally right for her at that time, taking into account that when a woman requests an abortion, requests that her pregnancy is ended, she doesn't do so to make an abstract decision. Very often women will say, in general, I'm not a great fan of abortion, but in my particular circumstances, it is the right thing for me to do now. Why should you be able to intervene in that?
I think firstly that from an experience of meeting women who do have that issue and are not so clear and are not so uninfluenced by other people and by friends, as I said, and what I've found through speaking to women who are in that situation is that often just the simple question, do you actually need some practical help, will turn that situation around. In fact, a friend of mine was chatting to a girl who was thinking of going in for an abortion, and all the girl was saying, far from being absolutely convinced that this was the right thing for her, she was just like, oh no, I'm just about to get married, my mum's going to kill me. And having had a chat, you know, just with my friend on the pavement, she realised that of course she could go and talk to her mum, and it would be fine. And indeed, my friend got invited to her wedding, and indeed the baby was born. And so this idea of standing between a person and the decision that's right for them is a bit of a caricature of what's actually happening. And I would definitely encourage people to read some of the stories in Abby Johnson's book Unplanned, because she worked for 8 years believing exactly what you believe, that she was doing the best for women. And she even watched situations where a woman was going into her own abortion clinic, and she was expecting twins, and the mother of the girl that was going in was crying out, please, please don't do this, I will bring up the children, it's going to be fine. And the girl was unmoved by these pleas, but Abby was very touched by them. So the truth is that life is more complicated. Families are sometimes pitched against each other. Things are extremely painful. And the fact is that women often find themselves going in for abortions because other people want them. And the heart-rending stories in And Still They Weep are my motivation, because it's not just babies that are lost, it's women's lives and men's lives that are so often ruined. And just to have a Google around men hurt by abortion will also provide for me motivation to make sure that people aren't being hoodwinked into thinking that this is an easier decision than it in fact is.
Thank you. Follow-up question?
Yeah, what do you think about those women who haven't been hoodwinked into that decision and who have thoroughly considered all of the options? Those women who, you know, I would say that, well, I know that around 15% of the women who come to be passed for counselling decide that they'll continue with their pregnancy. They fit entirely into the circumstances that you're saying. There are some women who will require practical help and can be given those practical help. But what I'm asking you about are those women who genuinely feel that when the options are placed in front of them, it is their decision to make. Do you accept that it is their decision to make?
I accept that they're making a decision, but I'm not sure whether morally, ethically, and according to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it really is morally their decision, because of the fact that they are, at that moment, a mother already, and that motherhood and childhood have special protection, and that if they were living in a culture that honoured the reality of motherhood, the seriousness of sexual life. Most societies, it was once pointed out to me, prior to our own, described sex by means of some kind of range of gods and goddesses. It was a sacred thing. Mircea Eliade's fascinating book, The Sacred and the Profane. And I think that the reason why I would say that people have limited horizons on their own freedom today is that we have limited our own horizons in considering the nature of our sexual lives. Again, reductionism has been at work. So that when they're considering that decision, they're deciding within a very limited framework. They're saying, my body, my choice, but they're not talking about my body, our baby, whose choice? And there's a larger picture at work there. And so that's why I feel that when there's a cultural shift taking place, by which we now have had, since the Abortion Acts around the world came in, 45 million abortions, that becomes a bigger question than does it feel right for me? Because possibly the time for that question was when sexual life was embarked upon.
Thank you. Now your turn to ask a question.
I would like to ask Anne, when she feels that a human baby starts to gain the right to life.
I think that the question, when does a human baby actually attain the right to life, is one that simply can't be answered in the abstract. Because I think it depends so much on the social circumstances and the practical circumstances that surround it. In a culture like Britain, for example, we can provide all kinds of intensive care that can allow babies' lives to be preserved at a very early stage. That in countries that are less resource provided, countries like India, countries like Africa, a baby that in this country we would assume would have the right to life simply cannot even consider being kept alive. I think that when we talk about serious abnormalities, there's a huge difference between women who desperately want measures taken to be able to keep their newborn babies alive. And very often they're not able to access those resources because society simply does not have enough postnatal facilities to enable those babies to be kept alive. So what I would like to see is us concentrating on those children who, where there is a real sense that we want to maintain that life, rather than these pregnancies where basically the woman who's carrying it does not feel that life is an option for her.
Follow-up question?
I'm struck that many men and women don't have the choice to have children because perhaps, you know, biology and time has taken over. And what do you feel about the idea that many men and women who would have been able to adopt perhaps in past ages before the Abortion Act came in are now finding that their right, desire and choice to have a child is mitigated by the fact that those babies, which they would love to have looked after if they'd been carried to term just for a few more months, they would have been able to love them, want them, look after them and make them healthy and happy members of society. Do you not feel that abortion is taking away their right and opportunity to choose to have a child?
I certainly don't. I think it completely misunderstands what the experience of infertility is.
Room to pose questions of our panelists. And so I think given that we started with Anne all the time, we should start with Sarah this time. And if anyone would like to pose some questions directed to her, clarifications or further discussion or anything, sir?
I just wanted to know about rape or incest, and would you accept that in those cases abortion is necessary?
That's a really, really important point. I was chatting on the phone to the BBC researcher on the same question, and I said to her, you know, the funny thing is, it's not that funny, but that women who have been raped are often the person not asking for the abortion, but their family members. And the second thing is that when you've had the trauma of rape, which is probably one of the worst experiences a person can go through research and through speaking to people personally who've had these experiences, and then an abortion afterwards to so-called heal the rape or get rid of the consequences of it, many of them found the abortion more traumatizing than the rape itself. So it's not an easy thing. And when I got off the phone, my new housemate, she was brand new, I didn't really know anything about her, she'd been listening to the phone call, and she said, "Oh my God, I've never heard anyone dare to say that." She said, "I haven't told anyone in the house yet, but my mum, I don't know her, but she was basically a victim of sexual abuse repeatedly by a member of my dad's friend circle of friends. She became pregnant at 14, and and she was told by her family, so it fitted in with the story, to have an abortion. She refused to do so. So they said they would throw her out. She said fine. They said, look, okay, you can have it, but give it away. She said fine. And so Cassie, my friend, was brought up. She's a black girl. She was brought up by white parents, and I've since met them. So Cassie is a tremendously talented, amazing, gorgeous person, writes screenplays and fashion designs, and is amazing. Her mother is a heroic character to my mind. And I think that it's important to remember that abortion, whatever Anne might say, is a trauma for the body. The mind might think it's not going to be a trauma, but it is a trauma for the body. And that this situation of rape and followed by abortion is not a healing answer. Many people who've had children after rape have said that that's the one good thing that came out of that appalling situation. So that would be my preliminary answer, and it certainly isn't an easy answer to give, but there's much evidence to show that it's not a ridiculous answer.
Thank you. We'll have one more question for her, and then move over to the other side. Sir.
Yes, I'm very sorry, but that's not actually an answer to the question in relation to the general topic of the debate, whether or not it is a right or a rights violation. You've explained why abortion after rape or incest may be an incredibly traumatic experience, but I mean, lots of things that we have a right to do could be hypothetically traumatic experiences. Could you possibly say whether you would nevertheless allow someone to have the right after an incestuous affair or an abortion, or a situation of rape, to then have an abortion, despite the difficulties that they may or may not have afterwards, because we can't know?
Very good question. Well, to go back to the point when you say, would you allow someone to have the right? I think what's important here is we're trying to think about, does this right exist? It's not a question of saying, do I, Sarah Nordwall, would I allow somebody to have that right?
I apologise, it's just that you as the spokesperson for the rights violation is what I'm saying.
Yes, no, you're absolutely right to bring it up, because it is the point. It is the point, you're absolutely right. Does that unborn child who has been produced by the rape have a right, intrinsically or not? That is the question. And does the mother or the father or the family instead have the right to get rid of it because of the traumatic circumstances? And I think that the answer to that question, I think I've probably answered by considering what is a human being and what is the nature of their dignity, no matter how they have been brought into the world. And so culture, of course, I would say, has to precede lawmaking, although lawmaking often shifts culture. But I would say that it has definitely got to be central, the question, what is human life? And if life leads to rights, because it in its own being exists, we cannot just say, you have the right to dispose of that child, unless you first ask the question, who is it you are disposing of?
Thank you. Now we will give the audience the chance to pose questions toward Anne. Yes.
So I've been a little bit confused, but Ms. Furedi, in regard to your opening statement, you talked about, the criteria for rights like being something like personhood, you talked about having hopes and dreams, and you talked about babies being able to be aware of what's going on. And when your opponent asked you when you thought the right to life began, you seemed to retreat to viability criteria whereby that baby can survive outside the womb. Both seem to involve problems. When you were asked the question, well, what about the idea of post-natal abortion, right? You rightly said it is a ludicrous concept because abortion only happens within a woman. But that doesn't strike me as what the question is asking. The question is asking, under your own metaphysical and ethical principles, surely this thing, which is infanticide, which we admit is not abortion, is licit ethically, insofar as if you believe that this infant fails the test for personhood, which it seems to do so, I mean, on any kind of philosophically robust notion of personhood, which I'm assuming you're taking when you use that technical philosophical word, it won't meet the relevant criteria in order to be of sufficient value to offset the limitations on the woman's autonomy. And so thereby you would be allowed to commit infanticide ethically, even though that wouldn't be an example of abortion. On the other hand, if you believe in the viability criteria, the problems with that seem to be that there are cases where there are living beings who aren't viable but aren't allowed to be destroyed just by the will of someone else wanting to exercise bodily autonomy. So I'm thinking of parasitic twins who maybe grew up into adulthood. One twin is dependent and not viable without the body of its partner twin, but that partner twin can't choose then to kill the former twin. So I'm wondering what really your stance is on when the right of it. Is it viability or is it personhood, and how would you defend against those kind of objections?
Okay, well I think what you need to do is you need to kind of untangle certain strands which I don't necessarily accept go together. So I have absolutely no hesitation whatsoever in saying that, you know, it's absolutely evident that a newborn baby does not suddenly meet the criterion of personhood that I described. It would clearly, I think it would be rather ludicrous and illogical for me to assume that something happens in the passage through the birth canal that suddenly confers on a baby something in and of itself, something intrinsic to itself that it didn't have beforehand. I don't think that that would be a defensible position. Does that mean that it doesn't have value? No, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have value. It has value of a newborn baby, which does not necessarily have personhood, but still has the status of potential personhood, and I can accord that value. I mean, I would actually accord, you're looking puzzled, but I would actually accord even the fetus, even the embryo within the womb a degree of value. I think it's more important, for example, than a goldfish or a cat. Just because I don't accord it value as a person doesn't mean that I don't accord it value at all. So, but what I'm saying is that once you are talking about an entity that is separate from the woman, then you no longer have the questions, actually, of bodily autonomy and bodily integrity. They don't need to be taken into account at all. So all of the issues that I was raising, which related to the rights of the woman, can be put to one side, and you can focus entirely on what you want to do or not do with that particular child without in any way impacting on the woman in the way that you must do if that is still within her body. So what I'm saying here is that there are kind of two issues. There's the issue of the status of the embryo and fetus, but there's also the question of the woman, and you have to look at those two things together, but they're not entirely tangled up.
Thank you. Another question for Anne there. I think I'll take someone from the side of the room, that's all right there. Sir?
So there's two questions. First, you made a very interesting comparison between forcing a woman to give birth and forcing someone to donate their organs to save someone else's life. Don't you think that it's a bit of a false analogy between the cases? Because one is an absence of action and letting someone else die, and one is more active, and one is preventing someone from living or even stopping someone's life. So that's my first question about that false analogy. And the other is, do you believe that more research in neuroscience, in medicine, will push the debates forward, will contribute to it, and maybe reduce the number of abortions in the future? If you believe that that's an inevitable evil, then do you believe that it will be inevitable in the future?
Okay. Right, well, on that, I take your point, right? Argument by analogy is always really fraught with problems. I mean, it was always really fraught with problems. The point that I was trying to explain through that particular one is simply that society seems to impose, well, when you look at banning abortion or preventing abortion because of the woman's responsibilities to the fetus or the embryo that she's carrying it confers on a woman a greater responsibility to the fetus or embryo than indeed it confers on the woman in relation to other people around her. So, for example, if I use the example of my own son, I have an 18-year-old son, if you're basically saying that I have a responsibility to maintain his life and so on while he's in my womb, you're conferring a greater responsibility on me when he is in utero than you are now, because if you look at those examples of the transplant that I was given, I was simply saying that society cannot impose on me the right to maintain his life now. How do I think advances in neuroscience and so on will go? Do you know, I honestly don't think that they will impact on the abortion discussion all that much, because I think that when we talk about abortion, we're talking about something which is different than fetal development. I think we're talking about the fact that women, whether you think it's right or not, sometimes find it intolerable to be pregnant. And the issue that's at stake with abortion is when a woman herself feels that it is wrong and intolerable for her to continue with the pregnancy, is there somebody else who can intercede in that decision and basically stop her from ending that pregnancy and then compel her to have the child?
Thank you. Now we will return to, if anyone has a question for Sarah.
This is possibly a sort of very narrow and technical point, but at the end of your first speech, you spoke quite emotionally about reducing the wombs of ladies in India to nothing but wombs. By that rationale, are you going to start campaigning against sperm banks because that reduces the genitalia of men to nothing but a pump that will produce semen that can hypothetically be used to create embryos and so on?
I completely agree with you, yes.
You have very consistent internal logic.
I do.
Very impressive.
I completely agree with you. Yes, I think that's an extremely important point, very well made. And
no one else asked a question!
I think it's an extremely important point. Why? Because, you know, there is integrity in the nature of the relationship between parents and children. And we are not just biological matter. And that's why I do think that neuroscience has some role to play. But as Anne said, it's not the whole role, because there is more. There is more to human life and to human relationship. Why is it that people who have been conceived through sperm donation feel often an aching longing inside to identify their father that cannot generally often be fulfilled? And if you've ever been friends with someone who is adopted, who's trying to find their parents, it can be a very big drama. And it can be surprising how we relate to unknown elements in our genealogy and our past. And just referring to organ donation as a slightly aside point, I like tangents anyway, but I was reading, just referring to the mystery of things really, someone who had a heart transplant. When he had the heart transplant, he then suddenly became incredibly interested in India and painted his house green. And anyway, he found out eventually who this heart had come from, and it was, surprise, surprise, somebody from India who lived not exactly in a green house, but he did go and visit the family of the person, and there indeed were the big green walls of the house they lived in. We are a mystery, and I think we should play fast and loose with bits of our own.
Thank you. Now we'll turn things to the other side. So a question for... Yes.
There's been quite a story in the news lately about supposed gender-selective abortions. Do you think those are grounds for abortion?
If you're asking me, are they grounds for abortion in law, or are you asking me if I think that they're grounds for abortion in a moral?
Well, I think both.
Okay. In terms of law, they're definitely not grounds for abortion in the sense that the law specifies quite clearly the circumstances in which women can have an abortion. As I indicated at the beginning, the issue about the threat to the woman's physical or mental health is a grounds for abortion. The law's silent on sex selection. You asked me whether or not sometimes the discovering the gender of the fetus may impact on issues pertaining to a woman's mental health. I have to say that I think sometimes it does. I think that if a woman finds out that she's carrying a child that has an inherited disease down some particular line, whether it's male or female, it may influence her decision. I think that if you're talking about a woman who is basically coming and she's saying that she feels that she has to have the child, that she has to have the abortion because if she feels that, because she knows that if she has a girl or a boy, her family will completely reject her and so on. It's an abhorrent situation. It's appalling. It ought to be changed. But nevertheless, I can understand why if a woman is in that kind of culture, she may very well feel that she can't cope with that particular pregnancy. So I think that we just have to be very alive to the circumstances in which women find themselves in. My own view, personally, is that, you see, to me, it's shockingly straightforward. To me, I honestly think that the responsibility for the decision has to rest with the woman herself. And that means that even if I think that a woman is making a huge mistake, even if I think personally she's making a decision that I would never want to make, I still think that it is her decision to make. And it's as simple as that, really.
Thank you. And now we have another question for Sarah. Yes.
I was just wondering, because you make quite a lot of emotional appeals throughout your talk scene. I was wondering whether you think the fact that you've met lots of people who were sad after abortions affects the way in which you construct a right. So, like, the possible implications for some people. How far that means that there isn't change in the right of them to do a certain action?
Well, it's an interesting question. It's always important to look at people's experience and how they form their opinions. But I wouldn't say that I would say that it's more that because of the opinions I hold, that I've had the opportunity to meet people who are willing to open up about how they really feel. Because when you meet people, when you read philosophical arguments, I think it's quite clear, and I certainly came to these opinions that I hold now. They've developed a bit, but when I was about 16, and I don't think I met anybody that had a sexual relationship, apart from my parents probably, by that time, you know, and so it really wasn't just because of that. And certainly I read around women's experiences, I hear about courses, I study things to do with, you know, Project Rachel and Silent No More. I'm interested in seeing if men are affected by abortion and so on and so forth. However, I think the philosophical arguments stand alone. I think they're very, very clear. I think they illustrate themselves, really. And so I would say that the latter has led to the former.
Thank you. And one final question now for Anne. Quite a number of hands shooting up here. Let's see. Maybe since you had your hand up earlier as well, do you have a chance, Dan?
You've expressed an opposition to infanticide, which I think everyone in this room would agree with. As you know, 90% of unborn children or fetuses diagnosed with Down syndrome are aborted, and they can be aborted up to birth. So a child with Down syndrome at 39 weeks within the womb can be aborted. A child with Down syndrome born a week premature at 39 weeks, you would say that could never be killed after birth. So what would be the difference between these two 39-year-old children? 39-week-old
We sometimes feel that at 39, still children, not Down syndrome, but I'm thinking of people in my own family. Because for me, it comes down to the fact that women should have the ability to make a decision about what's going on with their body. You know, I have to say that all the time that you are talking about a pregnant woman, even at 38 weeks, 37 weeks, whatever, you are still talking about a woman who I believe has the right to determine what will happen to herself. So that for me is completely fundamental. What I would say is that you have to have a very, very weird world in which someone is opting for an abortion to result in a dead child, which is going to involve exactly the same method of delivery as would be to have a live child. And I think because that's what the method of abortion is, late in pregnancy, it's a medical induction. And I think that what stops me from, in some ways, going down the rabbit hole that you're trying to take me down in that particular question is a fundamental trust for people to make sensible decisions for themselves. I have never heard of a woman I have simply never heard of a woman making that request or asking for that kind of treatment. And it's curious because right up until 1990, in Scotland there was no time limit on abortion at all, whereas in England and Wales there was a time limit of 28 weeks up until 1990. No time limit in Scotland, and yet there were no more late abortions taking place in Scotland than there were in England and Wales, because we don't need the law to tell us. Women are capable of making their own decisions for themselves.